get us started. The roll is circulating. We're going to finish up Locke, and I'm going to show you how, even though Locke, like Descartes and like the ancient philosophers, Locke is absolutely convinced that we live in a world that's real. It's not a dream for Locke. And it contains real material objects like these desks you're sitting on that are there whether anyone's around to perceive them or not. Right? For Locke, these desks were here in this room when it was an empty room, between the last time we were here and this time. So Locke believes in a real world, but the problem is to defend the existence of that real world, given that he is where Descartes put us, in the egocentric predicament. His view is that the mind is never directly acquainted with that real world. It is only acquainted with its own ideas. Remember, for Locke, an idea is a technical term for what the mind immediately perceives. And what the mind immediately perceives for Locke is its own ideas and sensations. But for him, some of those sensations accurately represent things in the real world, like the primary properties, because they resemble them. In other words, my subjective picture of the whiteboard over there accurately represents the size of it relative to the room, because size is a primary property. It accurately represents, because my picture resembles a rectangular object, and it accurately gives me information that the whiteboard over there is rectangular. But again, for Locke, the white color of it, the silver color of the metal that holds it together, those are subjective and in us, as well as if you went over there and put your hands against the metal in a chilly room and it felt cold. Sensations of heat and cold for him are secondary properties, and they're subjective and in us, but they're caused by the primary properties. Now, Berkeley, we're going to see, is going to try to convince us that there is no such thing as an independently existing world of material objects. That whatever we call material is really mental. And Berkeley is not mad. He's not insane. He's not trying to put us on. But his argument that there is no such thing as a material world fall out logically from the assumptions he's already gotten from Descartes and from Locke especially. And to understand Berkeley's view and even Locke's view, remember that for us, to us subjectively, a material object is nothing more than a combination of its primary and secondary qualities, the properties of the object, as we experience the object. But, okay. I thought I was recording and I'm not. That's okay. So at any rate, for this is about where we picked it up last time, so it doesn't matter whether I was recording, because I'm going to repeat some of the same points. Okay, so for us, a material object is a combination of the primary and secondary properties it has. But as we said, Locke thinks that our perceptions accurately give us knowledge of the primary properties things have because they resemble the objects themselves. As I mentioned, my subjective picture of the whiteboard resembles the whiteboard in that it's rectangular. It accurately conveys to me the information about the size. Size is a primary property. And the shape of the whiteboard is rectangular, but also its number, that it's one whiteboard. But for Locke, but as we saw, for Locke, the red color of the telephone is not really in the telephone as a property, but colors only exist because there are perceivers around capable of experiencing colors. But color is not a property of the telephone. Neither is the white color or the silver or the metal properties of the whiteboard over there. But they're caused in our minds by things like the motion of the molecules. Remember, Locke knows about the molecular theory. He was actually a friend of Newton's and of Boyle's in the Royal Society. The size and shape, though, of the telephone are really properties of the real telephone in the real world for Locke. And they are going to be there whether anyone is around to experience it or not, even though you need a perceiver around to experience the secondary properties like feelings of heat and warmth and color. So Locke's view separates us from the world, and he also believes that the world as it appears to us is different from the world as it is, a real world. We don't perceive the world as it really is. We perceive a world where objects have both primary and secondary properties, but for him, the real world has only primary properties. Now, this view has a name. It also is called representative perception, but Locke's view is called indirect realism. For Locke, we never do directly experience an external world. There is no causal action at a distance. In other words, our common sense view that when you seated in your seats are looking at that briefcase on the table, that you're looking at an object in the distance. No, the only thing the mind is immediately acquainted with is its inner ideas. But they represent the world, or at least some aspects of the world, to us, for Locke. So there's a difference between appearance and reality. So indirect realism, the doctrine that we cannot know the real world directly through our experiences, but we have to infer things about the real world from those experiences. But as David Hume later shows, and even Berkeley, this logical leap is very hard to justify. It leads to skepticism since we perceive only our own ideas directly and never what they represent. So how do we get knowledge of the real world for Locke? How many of you have ever seen our former president, Barack Obama, in person? Some of you have. I'm impressed. Maybe I need to pick somebody like Kim Jong-un who you've never seen in person. No, that's good. But note, even for the rest of you who haven't, you would believe that you would recognize the man if he walked into the room, right? Why? because you've seen images of him on television, over the internet, and newspapers and other places. So even if you haven't seen Barack Obama in person, as some of you have been able to do, you would be pretty sure that you have accurate knowledge of what the man looked like. I had something like this happen to me recently. Now, those of you who are not from Maryland may still remember that our former governor, Martin O'Malley, ran in the primaries against Mrs. Clinton in the last presidential election. So even if you're not from this area, he had a national exposure, right? Now, I had seen him once before in person. But anyway, I'm sitting in waiting for a haircut about 3 months ago in a little barber shop in Hamden in Baltimore, right? And everybody sits around in a big thing. It's kind of informal. So anyway, the door opens and somebody walks in carrying a laptop who looks like Martin O'Malley. And I'm thinking, is that who I think it is? And it was Martin O'Malley. And there he said, and now he was not my favorite mayor, nor was he my favorite governor. But nonetheless, you know, I'm going to be civil to the man in person, nodded hello. Now, even had I not seen him before, and before I recognized him because I had seen images of him. So, in other words, Locke thinks we have like a private mental image of something like the whiteboard over there, and that accurately gives us knowledge of some of the properties of it because our image resembles the whiteboard, just like an image of Martin O'Malley or of Barack Obama, whether it be on the internet or a video image, resembles the real person, right? But now here's the problem with a view like Locke's. It's called indirect realism. I need to get a more up-to-date illustration, but right now, when we played backgammon in the 70s, there used to be what passed for a big screen TV that say a bar would have or a restaurant. What was a projection TV like this, and they were absolutely horrible back then. They all had colors that were distorted, the pictures were fuzzy, because we used to play backgammon at the Ramada Inn, among other places, and there's the television set, and it's got a terrible picture on, and they never had them adjusted right. But by the 90s, these projection sets, which were the only large screen TVs you could get, either a projection set like this, or some of them, and maybe you knew a relative, or maybe your parents had one of the old projection sets where there's a projector inside this big box, and it shines not from the front, but from the back. So you have a big image projected. That's what was a big screen TV back then. So in the early 90s, I had a little money and I was going to upgrade my VCR. There were only video recorders then. But state of the art then was a hi-fi stereo VCR, and that's what I was going to get. So I went into a local stereo store that was much like H.H. Gregg or Best Buy, only it was a local one in Charlottesville, where I was living at the time when I was in grad school. And those big screen TVs had come a long way, and some of their pictures were pretty good by then, believe it or not. And the way they had these on display to demonstrate that the pictures were pretty good was and by the way, what passed for a home movie camera was a VHS movie camera that's the size of what you see professional video people carrying on the sidelines when they're walking on the side of a football or golf event or something. They were huge. I remember I had a relative that had one, and he was taking pictures of us at a family 4th of July thing, or it was a birthday thing for one of his kids. So anyway, what they had was one of these cameras set up on a tripod, and it was aimed at a doll that had a pretty dress on that was sitting on a doll-sized chair, right? Now, what am I getting at? Suppose way back then you had decided you were in the market for one of those big TVs, and you wanted the one that had the most accurate representation of things as they are. And so you wanted to check the colors on the screens of the TVs there with the doll. How would you do that? Well, you can already kind of imagine, right? You'd look at the dolls actually sitting on the chair with the camera pointed at it, and you'd look at the pictures and you say, well, what picture is most accurately reflects the real colors that I'm seeing there? Now here's where we're going with this. For Locke, on a view like Locke's, the pictures on the TV represent the fact that our mind is only acquainted with its own inner mental life, its own inner pictures. But on a view like Locke's, we never can get beyond our mental picture of the world to compare it with the way things actually are in the world, to see whether our inner representation of things in the world is accurate or not. And since we're going in Berkeley's direction, not only can't we defend the view that our subjective experience of the world accurately represents aspects of the world as it is, like the primary properties of things, but we can't even defend a view on Locke's, like Locke's. We can't even defend the view that it represents anything at all. We might be back to Descartes saying maybe our mind is producing all these representations and we think they just are caused by things in the external world. And David Hume, who was a skeptic, ultimately ended up in this viewpoint. He said, look, we can't show for sure whether the experiences we have that we think are caused by this table, those desks, by things in the external world, really are caused by them. And we can't defend the claim that there even is an external world. So, on a view like Locke's then, since we know things only indirectly, we have to infer what the real world is like. But, as Hume and Berkeley later pointed out, this logical leap between the subjective experience my mind has of the whiteboard and the whiteboard as it is in reality is never something that we can actually defend. So it leads to skepticism, since we perceive only our ideas directly and never what they represent, and we can never compare our ideas with reality to check their accuracy. As the 20th century philosopher Richard Rorty put it, we can never jump out of our own skin to get behind our perceptions to see if they're accurate. Now, George Berkeley. Now, John Locke. I've got a old book on my bookshelf that was written by Locke that was written on some aspect of Christianity. I think he was an Anglican Christian of some sort, but probably nowhere near as devout as Berkeley. George Berkeley was from Ireland and he was a professional university professor. He taught at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland, taught philosophy. But he later also became a bishop in the Church of Ireland, right, which was the State Church of Ireland at the time. So he's very devout. And he tried to stop Locke's view from leading to skepticism. He didn't like that. And he also was very suspicious of the view that there is an independently existing material world. Now, what did he think was so threatening about that view? Well, my mother used to have this old saying, you give them an inch and they take a foot. Berkeley is afraid that if you allow people the view that an independently existing material world is there, and it doesn't depend on anyone for its existence, real objects exist whether they're experienced by anyone or not, the people will take that view and go down the garden path to full-blown materialism. In other words, you give them the assumption that a material world exists, and they'll take it all the way to the conclusion that only a material world exists, that we're nothing but material beings. And so you can see why this is threatening to traditional Christianity. The scriptures say that God is a spirit, and those who worship him should worship him in spirit and in truth. Well, if there is no such thing as spiritual substance, what becomes of God? What becomes of our claim that we have an immortal soul? So Berkeley sees the very belief that there's an independently existing material world as threatening to his religious beliefs. Yeah.
I always think that Locke's whole point of view was that seeing that you don't know about this one thing, you can't say that it doesn't exist. But on that same point, you don't know. So just because that doesn't mean that it's real. Just because if you don't know that it doesn't mean that you cannot be like a source.
Yeah. Now, are you talking about Locke's view of the material world generally, or just Locke's view of God?
God.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I'm not sure of what is. I know he had some kind of a faith in God. I don't know very much about that, but but could very well be that. But I mean, Locke does not want to be a skeptic regarding the existence of a material world or the existence of God, whereas David Hume does. David Hume wants to say we should suspend our belief in these things. So Berkeley thought that what he would do is defend religion and philosophy against the materialists by essentially knocking the leg out from under the stool of the materialists. And he argued from principles that that were handed down to him from John Locke, that there is no such thing as a material world. One of the amusing things to read is Berkeley trying to defend himself against the claim that he is a skeptic and his view is abhorrent to common sense. Berkeley tries to say that his view is the common sense view, but for none of us is it the common sense view. He also says, I'm no skeptic. What is a skeptic but somebody who doubts of things? And Berkeley says, I'm not asking you to doubt the existence of a material world. I'm showing you straight off that there is no such thing as a material world. He wanted to defend the positive claim that there isn't. Now, how does he do this? Well, that's what we're getting to. So for Berkeley, he renounces Locke's indirect realism. There is no real world out there independently of perceivers. We perceive the world directly, but here's the catch. The catch is that everything we perceive is mental. Nothing is material. So we claim we have direct knowledge of physical objects, but all of these objects are mind-dependent perceptions. Now, mind-dependent means they are dependent on a mind for their existence. This is the view that Locke would have had concerning secondary properties. That, take the green color here in this slide. For Locke, that would be a secondary property. And he would say that green only exists if there's some perceiver around capable of experiencing green. So green as a secondary property is mind-dependent, as is things like feelings of warmth. It's getting a little stuffy in here. So for Berkeley, the world of common sense is ultimately a world where everything is mental. Nothing is physical. No physical objects exist independent of minds. And here's the way he expresses his view in his more technical book. Now, we tend to, if you pulled up a picture of George Berkeley on the internet, you'd probably get one taken late in life, maybe of him with full church garb on from a painting at the time. But Berkeley was kind of a prodigy, and he wrote some of his best philosophy when he was 20 years old, or 21. Not much older than any of you. So even though we tend to picture these people as old men, Berkeley was about your age when he wrote his best philosophy. For some philosophers, it was just the opposite. Immanuel Kant wrote his best philosophy after the age of 55. And he died, before the age of 50, Immanuel Kant would have some little, insignificant blurb in somebody's encyclopedia of philosophy, but he wouldn't be one of the greatest philosophers in the history of philosophy. This is a direct quote. Now, see the phrase esse est percipi? It means to be, to exist. To be is to be perceived by some mind or other. That little phrase encapsulates Berkeley's whole philosophy in a nutshell. Esse est percipi. And here's a direct quote from The Principles of Human Knowledge by Berkeley. Berkeley says, it is indeed an opinion strangely prevailing amongst men. He means men in the generic sense, among human beings, that houses, mountains, rivers, all sensible objects have an existence distinct from their being perceived by the mind, by the understanding. But he goes on to say, but what are the aforementioned objects but the things we perceive by sense? And now here's where he adopts the view that Locke also has. And what do we perceive by sense but our own ideas or sensations? And is it not plainly repugnant that any of these should exist unperceived? I'm going to come back to this claim in just a couple of minutes. And by the way, when I was over there in 1985, they were just beginning a restoration project on Berkeley's family home in Cloyne County, Cork, Ireland. And some of us went out there on a little trip they took us on. And they called it a castle, but it was really kind of a granite home that was in a lot of disarray. There wasn't a lot left of it, but we went up to the top. But it sat in a really beautiful scene. The countryside, there was a river, there were hills. It was very similar to this scene that I chose. So, for him to be is to be perceived. How does it get to this? Well, Berkeley agreed with Locke. He didn't have to revise Locke's views about secondary properties. For Locke, secondary properties like color, smells, feelings of warmth and cold, they are subjective and mind dependent. In other words, in order for them to exist, there has to be a perceiving mind around. And he provided some additional arguments in support of these. Here's an example of one of them. Let's say it's real cold outside, maybe even snowy, and you come in and say we've got a big fire going in a fireplace here, right? Now, you know how pleasant it can be if you come in from the cold and there's a nice fire going and you walk up and you stand by the fire to get yourself warm, right? Berkeley says a moderate degree of warmth is pleasure. It's a pleasurable sensation, right? It feels good to, get yourself warm by the fire. But let's suppose you try to warm yourself up too quick. Say, oh man, I'm going to get even closer. Oh, wow, that's hot. And you burn your hand a little bit, right? Because you got it too close. Berkeley says an intense degree of heat or warmth is a pain. But now wait a minute. You wouldn't want to say that pain and pleasure are in the fire as properties of the fire. A mild degree of heat is pleasure. An intense degree of heat is pain. But if you wouldn't want to say that pain and pleasure are in the fire, Berkeley says, why would you want to say that warmth is in the fire as a property of the fire, rather than it being subjective and in you? That's another argument Berkeley proposed to go with that argument we saw from Locke about the 3 buckets of water and warmth not being a property of things themselves. Yeah.
So is this that whole point of basically saying that you can never have a full interpretation of the external world? Because to me, if I take a shower with what's hot to her is cold and hot, scalding to me, and what's hot to me is cold to her.
Well, yeah, he does say things are subjective in that way. Right, yeah, you're right. I mean, to different people, things have different intensities too. And Berkeley understood this. So what Berkeley does, I used to have students, and at the University of Virginia, we had intro to philosophy students read one of Berkeley's little books that was actually a bestseller at the time. It was around 60 to 70 pages long, and it was called Three Dialogues Between Hylas and Philonous, where they discuss, Hylas represents the view that Locke has, that matter exists independently of perceivers. Philonous is the wise philosopher who takes Berkeley's immaterialist, idealist position. Okay, well, folks, it's louder than you think, guys. Okay. So where does Berkeley go from here? If he just stopped here, his view wouldn't be any different from Locke's. But what he does is he provided similar arguments, parallel arguments, to show that what Locke thought were properties really in things independently of perceivers, those primary qualities, Berkeley said, I can provide similar arguments to show that even they are subjective and mind-dependent. And here's an example, and the reason I chose this one, okay. There's an example in the next slide, but here's the way we can summarize Berkeley's view. In other words, if you can get what's going on in this slide, suppose I met you all at the door. There's nobody in the room, and I said, look, you guys got to watch out in the room. There is a pain, a shoulder pain, running around in the room, and I don't want any of you to get a pain in the shoulder. So just watch out, because there's a pain in the empty room. And you would look at me like I was from the moon, first of all, right? Because everybody knows that you can't have a pain running around without some sentient creature, whether it be an animal or a human being, who is capable of feeling pain. You don't have just a pain existing independently of its being perceived in a room, right? Well, the way people later in the 20th century used to discuss Berkeley is this way. And they probably still discuss it this way. For Berkeley, all sensations are viewed on an analogy with pain. It makes no sense to say a pain exists though nobody is feeling it or perceiving it. But what are pains? They're only perceived ideas or sensations. And for Locke, a pain is no different from any other perceived idea. Let me finish this slide. So for Berkeley, if it makes no sense to say a pain exists though no mind is perceiving it, it also makes no sense to say that other sensible qualities like color, sounds, taste, feelings of warmth and cold or hardness, and perceptions of shapes have an existence though no mind is perceiving them. Well, what is the upshot of that? It means that esse percipi, to be is to be perceived. In order for any object to exist, it has to exist as the perception of some mind or other. Now, did you want to... well, okay. Well, let me go where I normally go on this. Suppose I walk in your direction, right? I don't have any choice about whether or not I'm going to run into a table here. I am going to run into a table, right? In other words, that collection of ideas is beyond my will. Whereas I can close my eyes and imagine a horse. I can imagine it being a brown horse or a gray horse or some other kind. I can imagine a pony. I can imagine a full-grown horse. Right? Some perceptions we have are dependent and subject to our will. So for Berkeley, and here's where God comes in as an integral part of his whole philosophy. For Berkeley, those ideas that I have that are independent of my will are produced directly in me by God. So, the ideas I have of that table over there are produced in me by God. So in Berkeley's philosophy, you don't have any material objects existing independently of anyone perceiving them. So there's a sense in which when I see the table, I'm also seeing an idea that's caused in me by God, that's in God's mind as well as my own. So Berkeley's view, again, is called idealism or immaterialism. It would be better called ideaism, but that doesn't pronounce very well in English, so we call it idealism. All is mental for Berkeley. Only mental things exist which are either immaterial minds, our mind or God's mind, or the ideas, the perceptions of minds. There is no material world. In other words, the perceptions we have are what exists. They don't represent a world beyond them. Now, for Berkeley, this is not a skeptical view, again, because he says, I'm not telling you to doubt the existence of the material world. It's a skeptic who wants to doubt of things. I want you to deny the existence of the material world and agree with me. Okay, I said he used similar arguments. In other words, his strategy in that book, Three Dialogues, is to first provide additional support for Locke's claim that secondary properties are mind-dependent. But then he attacks the primary properties, and here's where he gets to immaterialism, and here's an example of an argument he uses. Now, this seems like a strange argument. Take a little dust mite. You can barely see it. It's about the size of a period on a piece of paper. Usually they're little red things, right? Extremely small to us. In other words, size. Like the size of that whiteboard for Locke is a primary property that's really the size. My subjective experience of the whiteboard really reflects the size of that whiteboard in the real world. There is for Locke such a thing as the size of the whiteboard. There is not for Berkeley. Size is relative and mind dependent. So a mite's foot would be extremely small to us since the mite itself is the size of a period. But from the mite's perspective, it would be of ordinary size. Now, in Berkeley's day, there were microscopes around. They knew about one-celled organisms, knew about germs. To a microbe, the mite's foot would be absolutely huge. Now, if this seems like too strange an example, anybody, I always like to get a window seat in a plane. I still don't believe they can get those things off the ground. I'm like a kid when it comes to planes, right? Think about it. I love to watch as the plane ascends and watch the people on the ground? Now, to the people walking around on the ground, their feet are normal size, right? But as you get up in that plane and gain height, the people walking around on the ground get smaller and smaller and smaller till they're about the size of a mite. And yet their feet are normal size to them. And if they have a germ on their foot seems huge to the germ. So what's he saying? He's saying a primary property like size is mind dependent and relative to the perceiver. Because he says the mite's foot can't be two opposite properties, can't be both small and huge, the way it's perceived differently by different organisms. So he says, how do we get out of the contradiction? The same way we got out of the contradiction with the secondary property of heat and cold, by claiming that size is subjective and in us, and there's no such thing as the size of the mite's foot. Size is dependent on and relative to a perceiver. So that's a good place to stop then. So he provides, let me just tie it up with this slide. He provides arguments that also show that the primary properties are mind dependent and subjective. But if for us what we experience as a material object is nothing but a combination of the primary and secondary properties, but now, after Berkeley's arguments, all of them are mind dependent, then the whole object is mind dependent, dependent on a perceiver for its existence. And esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived by some mind or other. Okay, we'll pick this up next time, and then I'll see where we go from there. Thanks very much. Again, if you didn't get your paper, come up